Lord by how's it going today? Glowplasma231 here, back in day, talk about a 37-page chapter of World Trigger. Of course, this is our chapter number 239. This is our chapter for February of 2024. I almost said 2023, but no, we are in a completely different calendar year now. And like I said, this chapter is 37 pages. Of course, we have not had a chapter since November of 2023, right? So it has been 3 months since a World Trigger chapter, which is like a really big deal. I mean, I don't know if this is one of the longer breaks that Ashihara has taken since, of course, the big hiatus in, what was that, 2017? Or was it 2016? I forget when it was. It may have been, yeah, I think it was 2016, and it came back in late 2017, early 2018, but don't quote me on that. I was not reading World Trigger at that time, right? I've been reading it exclusively since it was in this monthly format, so. But yeah, because of that 3-month break, we have a 37-page chapter this week. You know, 2 chapters, like one that's like your regular page count, and our one that's like your regular 19-page count. We have a just true 37 pages, which is like 2 of those now that I'm thinking of it, but that's besides the point. Of course, last time on World Trigger, we had the whole sort of set of chapters about, okay, the new special assignment is to create Tryon soldiers to be able to use in the upcoming battle sims. And of course, we had the whole thing with Suicide Squad 7 making all of theirs last time and learning about the ins and outs of the creation program. And then we switched over to Wakamura's squad. What is that? No, it's not Wakamura, it's Utagawa Squad 1. Utagawa Squad 1. We haven't really seen much on Wakamura yet, but we will get some Wakamura stuff in this chapter. We saw some Utagawa Squad 1 stuff as they were going through, and Yuma sort of laid out his plan, saying like, hey, I know neighborhood stuff, so this is how we're going to do it. And the entire team, especially like Urashima, was like, alright, sounds good, that's how we're going to do it then, right? Then as we get into it, I'm armed with my World Trigger chapter, or not chapter, volume 24, so I can easily tell all the characters' names that I've forgotten, because let me tell you, in this first set, I have forgotten a bunch of them, because we start off this chapter with OG Squad 2. Of course, this is the squad that Ikoma is on, Obishima, and of course everybody's favorite Tsuji, right? Of course with OG too, right? So we sort of start off the chapter as Ikoma is looking around at everybody's Tryon soldier creations in the team, right? And he looks over to Tsuji and he's just like, oh man, Tsuji, that's like really sick, right? That's awesome, right? And we see that Tsuji has created a dinosaur type Tryon soldier, right? It's just like a regular T-Rex looking dinosaur with just like some scale armor and a massive sort of 2 painted on its back, of course, for the squad number, right? And Ikoma's like, oh man, Tsuji, you're into dinos? I guess you're just a kid at heart having fun, right? But Tsuji just looks over to him and he's like, no, Ikoma, I'm not just some kid at Child's Play, right? And he pretty much brings up a very good point here, saying that it is fairly safe to say that the neighbors' Tryon soldiers have left a very bad impression on the people of Mikado City. And he says, so if Border is going to be making Tryon soldiers of their own, I figure that they should be very visually distinctive than the Tryon soldiers that we all know today. And of course, yeah, we've never seen a Tryon soldier that does look like a T-Rex. Of course, we've got like I guess if you want to sort of relate it in like dinosaur terms, there's like the Brachiosaurus, which would sort of be more of that Bamster type, and then you've got like Rads and Marmots and all those other types of Tryon soldiers, which I'm sure you could find a like somewhat dinosaur equivalent, but you're not going to find a T-Rex Tryon soldier unless until whenever we get into the neighborhood. Because I'm guessing since Tsuji is part of Ninomiya Squad, right? Since he is on that team, he will be going. So that may be a fun thing for Ashihara to do, is if we ever get to that point, is have some neighbor in Africator be a dinosaur, and Tsuji's like, what? I created that, right? That may be a fun little joke to play out eventually. But as Tsuji sort of just says all this to Ikoma, like, pretty much just, like, smacks him down, saying, like, no, I'm not just a kid, I'm being smart here, right? Obishima speaks up, and she's just like, oh yeah, it'll really make it easier to tell people in Mikado City who's a good Tryon soldier and who's not a good Tryon soldier, right? And of course, Tsuji with his whole thing of, oh no, it's a female, it's a woman, right? Sort of has his things, like, he's like, oh, well, my visuals, creation aside, it's just a standard shooter type, right? It's nothing special, it's just a shooter type that looks like a dinosaur, right? Which is one of the upsides of this program, is they can really make whatever type of design they want to, right? And to this, Tsuji looks over and is like, hey, Ikoma, what about your Tryon soldier, right? And Ikoma's just like, oh, well, how about we just skip me for now, as we get a look at Ikoma's screen, and he made pretty much a Marmot that looks like poop, right? He pretty much just made a poop Marmot, which You just gotta love Akoma, man. Akoma's just peak, right? And Akoma even says, like, hey, I'm not sure that I actually understood the assignment. And everybody sort of just looks at him, but nobody sees what his poop Tryon soldier, so it sort of makes sense. And at the same time, Akoma goes over and is like, hey, OG, what did you make, right? And OG says that his Tryon soldier is one that you equip on your shoulder, right? And Akoma's like, so are you equipping like some gear, like somebody in an RPG, right? And OG pretty much explains that it is a small little Tryon soldier that will fit on your soldier, and it is loaded up with a sharpshooting trigger that auto-targets the enemy when they're exposed. As we get a little visual here of like if Akoma and OG were fighting and they had their Kogetsus down, they're going in for a swing in the middle, right? Clashing their blades together, right? Taking them off and swinging again. We sort of see that this little Tryon soldier on OG's shoulder just puts a bullet through Akoma's head, right? Just takes him out, right? And to this, the operator, whose name that I totally didn't forget, Hikari Nire, maybe I'll remember her at some point. Hikari just comes over and she's like, oh man, that's actually pretty neat, but you actually can't use that thing in a battle sim today, right? And OG's like, oh, well yeah, of course I knew this, right? Sort of showing his whole, oh yeah, I'm OG, I'm the king, I know what's going on here, right? And OG's like, yeah, I mean, I need one for the sim too, so... But he says that when they gave us the order to make Tryon soldiers geared towards battle sims, I just think that was a way of management taking it easy on us, right? Because he's like, because making something from nothing without any guidelines or goals is almost impossible in a way, right? And Hikari's just like, I mean, yeah, that does make a lot of sense. And OG's like, so you remember just hearing about Suji's process, right? I mean, Border is looking towards the future and is probably hoping to get some unique designs out of this whole situation. So he's like, and the way I see it, tackling it that way is just a lot more fun. And I totally agree with OG here, because that's like a problem that I have with video games like Minecraft in a way, right? Minecraft is a game that's one of those perfect sandboxes. You just go out and you build and you create your own story. But for me personally, I don't like to do that. I like to play a very narrative-driven game, right? And having no shackles on me in Minecraft, just being told, hey, go do this, go do that. Yes, it can be fun, but it really does take a toll. And you're like, well, should I be building this or should I be building that? Or at least that's the way that I view it. And in the same way, that's what OG is relating here to Tryon soldiers. He says, if it wasn't for that stipulation of, hey, create something for the battle sim today, then a lot of people would probably struggle in making a good design, when he's just like, I just felt like being creative and making this little Tryon soldier that will kill people through the head, right? So I really do like OG's thought process here, right? And we see here that OG's now scrolling through all of his designs. We actually don't see his computer, but Hikari just points over to his screen. He's just like, oh, well, what's that one on there, right? And OG's just like, oh, that one you attach to your back, and it gives you, giving you mid-air mobility, sort of saying that, like, it's a jetpack, right? And they're just sort of, like, talking, and they just start to talk a little bit more, and like, oh man, what's that one? And, oh, that one's, I don't know, a arm cannon, right? So Suji's showing all of these just Tryon soldiers off, as Akoma, who's also looking, just looks over to his computer screen, see his Tryon soldier, the good old pile of poop it is, and he's just like, oh no, for shame on me, right? And Suji's just like, dude, is there a problem? And we don't get any resolution to that as we cut over to Kuruma's Squad 5, as we mainly get Yuba sitting here, right? As Yuba's sitting down, and it doesn't look like he is having a good time whatsoever. As we see that Kuruma's just like, hey, Yuba, you're looking really grim. Is, like, everything okay over there? And Yuba is just like, nothing is up at all, right? And Hikari is sitting there, and he's just like, oh man, I mean, this is a pretty tough puzzle. I was like figuring out where to spend on the limited budget, right? And we see that Korai is also here. That's right, Korai is his name. Korai is like, well, you guys know, right? If you hover your cursor over the text, a tooltip pops up with a little examination. And he's just like, I mean, it's made things easier for me to come up with. He's like, to imagine concrete terms, as we see that he's hovering over the support function, and we get just a little few ideas about support, right? The operator Asano then speaks up, and she just says, like, hey, Koala, which that's what she calls Korai. She's like, hey, Korai, I want to make something that flies, but this stuff's, like, really too tricky. I don't really get it. As we see all of these stipulations for flying in the Tryon Soldier Crater, as we pretty much see that whenever it is selected as flying, it incurs -5 action tokens and -2 evasion. It is unaffected by terrain while moving, it cannot equip a sniper rifle, and when an aerial unit engages with a ground unit, both suffer from aerial range adjustment, incurring a -6 to range. The aerial range adjustment effect is reduced by the ground unit's elevation. Which a lot of that does make sense. That initial thing of like, hey, if it's flying, it needs less action tokens to move around. So you don't want to make this thing just too overpowered so all of them are flying. It cannot equip a sniper rifle because, yeah, I don't just want like a flying helicopter with a sniper rifle coming off of it. And especially with the whole idea of the range is the advantage that these flyers have. That would be like the perfect sniper, but using them as I'm guessing they'd mostly be a gunner instead, unless they're like on a swoop down and be like a melee attack. I don't know, I'm sort of imagining this as the Vengefly King from Hollow Knight, if anybody's ever played that game, but just sort of that whole thing where it just swoops down as a melee attack and just calls it a day. And now I'm just imagining it like it's just got a head that's a Kogetsu or something and just goes and pierces through one of these characters. I don't know. And then this whole idea of aerial range adjustment, incurring a -6 terrain, which makes sense if something on the ground, which has a sniper rifle, can't just, like, pierce through it, I guess. But, Kurai just starts to speak up some more, and he's like, yeah, sure it is a little complicated when it's all explained in words, but just think about it, what it means for a unit to be flying. And he pretty much says that when your unit is flying up high, both parties will have a tougher time hitting each other. But if the unit on the ground comes up to a higher elevation, it'll be much easier to land attacks, and that goes both ways. As we sort of just see that a Tryon soldier is floating 7 units above the ground, and at an elevation of 7, and the on the grounded unit is at an elevation of 2, there's a 7 distance between them, right? And whenever the grounded unit moves up to an elevation of 4, there's a 3 distance between them, right? Makes perfect sense. It's basic arithmetic. Makari then just talks up more, and he's just like, you mean you need that range more than ever to make up for the height that you're flying at? As Kurai's like, yeah, pretty much. Osano then just says like, hey, so does flying make it stronger or weaker, right? And Kurai pretty much says like, hey, it definitely makes it strong against enemies with low range, but it's very weak against those who boast high attack range for all their attacks. And he says, like, unlike the other leg types, the flight option incurs stat penalties, not bonuses. As we see the whole movement type attributes chart, as we see that 2 legs gives you +1 attack, +1 defense, and +1 evasion. 4 legs in a beast mode gives you +1 action token, +1 support, +1 evasion. 4 legs as an insectoid is +1 action token, +1 attack, +1 dexterity. And 6 legs as an insectoid is +1 attack token and +2 dexterity. And we then see again flying is a -5 action tokens with a -2 invasion, and it ignores terrain when in motion. I think what we have here is actually a typo in the chapter, because of course I'm reading this off of Viz and Shonen Jump, and on the screen before, when it was giving the flying, like, hover over stats, it says incurs -5 action tokens, -2 invasion. And here in the flying category on this table, it says 5 action tokens, -2 evasion. I'm guessing that one of these is a typo, and from the way that, again, Kurai says, like, hey, it incurs penalties, not bonuses, I'm guessing that's supposed to be a -5, but I'm sure this will be fixed at some point in collected volumes. But it can be a little bit of like, so what's actually meant by this? But it's not really that big of a deal. I'm just going off of the idea that it says -5, so it makes perfect sense that these units aren't super, super overpowered, right? Kurai continues explaining his whole thought of like saying like, hey, cost-wise, you have to juggle attack, defense, mobility, and probably sacrifice one of those ultimately, right? Osano then just like, so flying soldiers are actually kind of sluggish, huh? And Kuruma just says like, hey, I just think of them as slowly wafting around, right? And he's like, or at least that's how I just see it. Osano just says like, well, it's fine. I don't really think it needs to attack, right? As we see that what she has created is just a flying radar type emitter type Tryon soldier. As we see that it sort of is flying, and it sort of has 6 legs, but from each of those it's got fly rings around it from where it boosts up into the sky. and it sort of has that typical Bamster sort of head profile with two bigger ears, almost like rabbit ears coming off of it, right? And Korai makes a little bit of note of, oh, hey, that'll be a nice Trion Soldier to have to take other units down, or to... Korai then just sort of makes a little note just saying, like, hey, that's nice, that'll be a Trion Soldier, it's actually going to be pretty hard for others to take down. Hikari then says, like, hey, but doesn't that make sniper units, like, extremely essential in this whole game? He's like, for shooting down flying units, I mean, because if everything's just melee or gunners, the flying units are going to truly win. Right, but Korai just says, like, hey, having a few around would give us a lot of a peace of mind, as he says, like, hey, I think mid-range units are a better bet than ones with a super long range, which is sort of just okay, as we just see two different shooter units here, and we pretty much see that one of them has a max range of 10, and one of them has a max range of 20, and we pretty much just see, like, how much worse the sniper rifle one is with the extremely long range, just due to the nature of, hey, it's gotta use a lot of power for that really high range, and the total max shots it can have, right? So, it's definitely an interesting little visual. Kuruma then speaks up and he's just like, hey, what exactly is the highlight of attacker units then? He says, why are they good if they're so bad against flying units, right? Korai then just says, like, hey, blades don't require ammunition, so you get a decently strong unit for a low cost. Makes perfect sense, as of course, the blade is just damage and range, while all of the standard shot, sniper rifle, meteor, and grenade are all just like damage, range, and ammo, as we see that meteor and grenade also have a splash damage attribute to them, but most importantly, they all have some sort of ammo that you have to spend points on getting a good amount of, right? And Kuruma pretty much sums this up by saying, like, hey, that means that that saved cost and not having to get ammo, you can go to somewhere else, giving a bunch of strong but yet cheap units, right? And Korai is pretty much like, yeah, makes perfect sense. As we finally cut back over to Yuba, who has been completely silent this entire time, I guess. He's just sort of been sitting there, and we even see in this panel that he's just, like, got a black, like, smog around his head, like he's just totally wrapped up in this, and he's just like, Korai, please, just lend me your wisdom on this, right? Like, please be my arch-druid, like, help me out here, right? And Korai's just like, sure, how can I help you? And that's where we end off this section with Kuruma's Squad 5. As we move over next to Kakizaki's Squad 3, as we see the main man here, Kakizaki, sitting here, and he's just like, oh wow, you actually made a really elaborate one, Taichi, because of course this is the squad that Taichi is on. Of course, our good old buddy Taichi Betsuyaku. Good old stupid hat kid. And we pretty much see this Trion Soldier. It is a six-legged insected type that pretty much has a divot in its body where people can stay in, and that's sort of what Taichi explains here. Is Kakizaki just says, like, hey, so Taiki, what was the whole idea behind this Trion Soldier, right? And Taiki's just like, oh, this one, it can perform rescues on the battlefield, right? And he pretty much explains all the features that he put into it, and he's like, well, this thing, since it's an insectoid type, and it can clamber over ranged terrain where vehicles with wheels can't tread, and it can rescue people who didn't evacuate in time. As we see that there's also a force field that's put onto this thing to protect people on the inside once they get there. So this is like a real humanitarian, like, sort of utility Trion Soldier, sort of like a rad in a way, how those sort of are meant for a more utilitarian purpose than a, hey, this is a rabbit, it is meant to kill and capture, right? So it's a different type of Trion Soldier, right? And Taiki just explains this thing like, hey, I was thinking that maybe a flying unit would give the passengers a less bumpy ride, but in the end, it's better off having all of that solid armor on the ground, because of course we just heard about all the flying disadvantages, so it makes perfect sense, right? And Kakizaki's like, okay, and your second creation here, is this thing for, like, patrolling? He's like, I don't see any weapons on it at all, as we see it as just, like, a little bit of a dog Trion Soldier, like, not like the hound Trion Soldiers we're used to in the past, but it's pretty much just like a little dog with two handlebars on it you can hold. And we see that Taiki says that this is a mount for snipers. And he says, hey, when a sniper's being hunted by a fleet-footed attacker, they can hop on it and ride off and put that attacker in the rear view mirror, right? And we sort of get a little bit of an image here of Taichi riding one. Of course, Taichi is a sniper, and he's riding one as Yuma is chasing him. Of course, Yuma is a really fast combatant, so it makes perfect sense for why Taiki made this one, because it would be something that he would actually want to use on the field in a sort of mount sort of role. Operator Fujimaru speaks up next, and she's just like, all right, Taiki, well, hang on. The special battle sims today only involve these Shrine soldiers, and she's like, how are you planning to win with a mount that can't actually attack, right? And Taiki's like, oh, what are you talking about? These creations aren't actually meant for the Sims. As we see that, of course, this is the squad that Inukai and Kagiura are also on. And the two of them just look over very questioningly to Taichi. And of course, Kagiura's here, so Kagiura knows what Taichi is actively thinking, has been thinking this whole time. But he sort of still shows a little bit of a, huh? And I sort of do like this, how this is portrayed in a way, because we see Inukai and we see Kagiura, and Inukai does have a question mark next to his head, and Kagiura doesn't, which, just as a small little detail, this question mark is probably my favorite part of this chapter, just because it shows what these characters know, and that's one thing I really do like about Ashihara, right? But back to Taichi's whole motivation here, as he just says, like, hey, Shrine soldiers might just seem like a battle mechs at a glance, but out in the neighborhood, I think they're more like transports, right? And he's like, I mean, if we even think about it, the ship that Border uses for away missions, I mean, it sort of even resembles a Tryon soldier, yeah? And he's like, I bet that's because Tryon soldiers started out as machines for transporting people and cargo, and along the way, they turned into weapons of mass destruction. And that is a very interesting idea in my mind, because of course we can sort of see that in our own world, right? I mean, cars, and then you got like tanks. I mean, over time, whatever you make can eventually be turned into something that can harm others. So just a little interesting introspection there by Taichi. Taichi just continues saying like, hey, before they were used as weapons, they were all used for carrying stuff, and I'm just taking them back to that origin and greatly expanding upon it, right? As we see that Kakizaki here gives like a big smile, sort of looking down at Taiki like, man, this kid's actually getting it all figured out here, right? As even Kagiura's just like, oh, hey Taichi, did you eat just like a power-up or something? And he's just like, me? No, I never would, right? As it really makes a lot of sense, because this is just Taiki's character. He's just a big nerd at heart, even if he does wear a really stupid hat, right? And Inukai just speaks up from there, just saying like, hey, I mean, I get it, Taichi's like, on a special assignment 2 days back, you wrote something about using Marmods in the rank wars, yeah? And Taichi's like, oh yeah, and he's like, little did I know they'd be asking us to design our own tried soldiers, and he's like, and the setup allows for a lot of actual creative freedom, right? As we see that Fujimaru Operator is like, hey, fair point, but hold on. And before she can sort of say anything, Inukai is just like, hey, so has this all lit your creative urges under you, right? Have they lit a fire? And Kaguya also just says like, hey, I love the scene. It's like, keep on trucking, Taiki, right? And Kakizaki even just starts saying like, hey, Trine Soldier's not meant for battle? He's like, sure, that's a fun direction to take it in, right? As all of them are sort of just like talking, and Taichi's like getting really, really hyped up, right? And eventually Fujimaru's like, wait, but Kakizaki, you've got to realize. And Kakizaki's like, yeah, okay, I get what you're thinking, Fujimaru. Is he's just like, sure. Taichi's ideas cannot be used in the battle sims, but they could be a helpful line of thinking for the special assignments. And he says, it's hard enough to guess how many rank war, how many wins we'll rack up in the sims, so setting that aside, it's by no means a bad thing to have some solid answers ready for the other special assignments, right? As we see that both Inukai and Fujimaru are just like, oh, well, I mean, if you really think so, right? As eventually Kakizaki just says like, hey, that said, Taiki, you do need to make a unit capable of fighting for battle sims later, right? And of course, Taichi's just like, all right, roger that, I'll get on it after I finish making this, I don't know, humanitarian piranha plant sort of looking thing, I don't know. At this point, we cut over to Mizukami Squad 9, which of course, we are very, like, adequated with him at this point. We know what this whole squad's get up is. It's all the smart people, right? As we sort of start off with Kakizaki, or Mizukami, I don't know why I call him Kakizaki, we're just talking about Kakizaki. It's Mizukami, not Kakizaki. Mizukami sort of sitting here and looking at his Triumph Soldier. and or not his Shrine Soldiers, but the Shrine Soldiers of his team, as he's just like, oh man, these are some very interesting Shrine Soldiers that Toroya and Kasho put together, and he's like, they're leaning in the extra balanced do-it-all direction, and he's like, as confident as they are on their own output, that leads to using fighting styles that are almost way too balanced. As he just says, like, meanwhile, I'm over here thinking that we got a shot with a better gimmicky glass cannon pawns that hit hard and really fast, right? As Arifune sort of speaks up, and he's like, hey, Mizukami, like, do we have any, like, big strategies planned for today? And he's like, if not, are we just free to design our soldiers however we want? And Mizukami's like, yeah, just go ahead and do it. As he's just like, there's almost too much to handle today with the special sims. And he's like, and if I'm being, like, truly honest, I don't actually know where to start. As he says, it's like a game of shogi, except each side is playing with pieces that the opponents never laid eyes on before. And he's just like, not to mention, there's no guarantee that a piece's visuals will even match its abilities, right? As we sort of get a lot of ideas, and of course, we know in the past that yes, Mizukami knows how to play shogi. Oh, it's crazy, right? He's a really smart cookie, right? But I do just like how we get the image of a shogi board, and we see there are a bunch of shogi pieces that are like a cow, Yokohama, ninja bee, a regular bee, the second sun, a polar bear, right? So there's a bunch of these different pieces, and also that idea of, hey, you don't know if the bee thing is actually a bee or if it's actually like a T-Rex, right? You don't actually know the abilities that these Shrine Soldiers have. Another just really cool idea I would love to see fleshed out more whenever we get into the big robot battles, pretty much, right? Mizukami just continues. He's just like, heck, I can't even imagine how these battles are going to play out, which, hey, I was just saying, I'm ready to see them. But we see that Kasho's just like, well, I mean, you are right. But he's like, since we're able to influence the designs in this setting, of course, just like, that's like a little bit of a mute note that he doesn't even get to finish, as Toroya just sort of cuts him off and is like, hey, yeah, I mean, there's a chance that appearances could be used to disguise a unit's true abilities, right? And who's his face? Kasho just starts getting to saying like, hey, flying units and snipers aside, there's no way to tell what they can do until we really face it. And we sort of see how he's thinking about this, as a flighted unit is flying, and a sniper rifle and a sniper Shrine Soldier has a really big gun on it somewhere, so it makes a lot of sense. Cone the operator then is just like, hey, but all the terms are up against the same conundrum, so why are we going to lose out against them comparatively? Kasho then speaks up and he's like, hey, so instead of waiting for the enemy to make a move, we're more likely to be able to win by hitting our heart of our own gimmicks. As Toroya then is like, hey, don't be the team that adapts and adjusts. Instead, we'll be the team that dupes and deceives, right? As Kasho's like, oh yeah, I guess that makes a little bit of sense, right? But Mizukami's then just like, yeah, I get what you two are saying. And he looks over to Arifune and he's like, hey, Arifune, Cone, any thoughts from you two? And Arifune just sort of says like, hey, I'll do whatever they want to do. And Cone pretty much says the same thing. And she's just like, hey, we'll have our work clearly cut out for us, right? As Mizukami's just like, all right, then, well, we'll go ahead with Kasho and Toroya's ideas this time around. And the two of them are just like, all right, let's do it, roger that. As we suddenly cut over to the monitor room, where we see two people are sitting there talking to each other. I don't quite know who these people are, but I think we get the names here in a second. I didn't pre-read this chapter like I normally do, but we're just going to go talking about it as we do, and I'm not going to look too far into it, right? So after a little bit of research into this, they actually say the guy's name like a page later. It's Katagiri. I knew it started with a K, and I knew it was from that squad. I just didn't remember what the guy's name was. But this is Katagiri, and the unnamed female operator, who I'm just going to call female operator, right? So pretty much the female operator just gets into it, and she just says like, hey, Mizukami's playing the role of a more typical leader today. And he's like, well, through yesterday, he was basically a one-man show. Katagiri then just says like, hey, since he approached yesterday's matches assuming they might lose more than they'd win, he really tried to take charge of his own decisions as the leader without actually delegating assignments. Female operator's just like, hey, so why keep his squad mates from getting judged way too harshly? As Katagiri says like, oh, well, I guess so. And he's like, meanwhile, today he's having his squad mates take the plan in leading. And he's like, he wants them to share in the wins and the achievements and not have it be just what he does, right? As the operator's just like, oh, well, did he really put, like, that much thought into it? As Katagiri's just like, I think he did. And he says, he started off with that I don't know, nothing act, but he still communicated the key point here. As he says, it looked to me as if he gave Kasho and Troya a big hint in a very roundabout way. As the female operator just says, like, hey, so to make it all seem like their big idea, and Katagiri says, like, that's part of it, sure, but it's also an approach that fits their personalities better. As we just see, he's like, some people are better at taking instructions when told to, and some take better action to do stuff, no hesitation, he says, while other people prefer to think for themselves and act based on what they think. As we see just a few images of different people here, as we just see like this more self-motivated and more followers, and these are just like a bunch of different people. Like, if I'm not mistaken, one of these first ones is the operator Rokuta from Kodera Squad 6 right now, and her whole thing is like about everything, question everything. We also see, who is this character? I don't know who the one in the middle is. That could be literally anybody, but if I'm not mistaken, this one is Ko, as he's just like, hey, I'd rather leave all the decisions to the more brainiac people. And finally we see Tsuchi, who's just like, hey, I want to contribute to the team, I want to contribute, as we sort of get the idea of like, hey, Rokuta is more of a self-motivated person, while, oh, why am I forgetting the guy's name? Kitazoe and, oh, golly, I just can't think Tsuchi's names. They're more of a follower type of a person, right? And the operator just continues saying, like, hey, and I suppose that Kasho and Toruya are that latter type of being the I prefer to think and act on themselves. And Katagiri's just like, exactly. And they're like, oh, interesting, pretty cool, right? And the operator just says, like, hey, are you always just attentive and thoughtful with your own people, Katagiri? And, oh, that's where you get Katagiri's name. I'm pretty sure that we knew this was Katagiri before, but this could have been, like, the big reveal, and I've just totally forgotten about it, which, honestly, it could have been, but I'm pretty sure there was that big chapter at the very beginning where we got a whole bunch of boardroom talk, and that's, like, where we met most of the Kusakabe Squad people, like the frog-looking girl. So I think we've seen Katagiri there before, but I just didn't remember him. As we see that eventually the whole thing is like, hey, are you always that attentive and thoughtful? And Katagiri's is like, me, no, I wouldn't go that far. As we see the operator's like, oh man, Mr. Humble over here. And as we cut away from Mr. Humble, we finally go over to the probably least unhumble squad, as we cut over to Wakamura Squad 11, because of course Wakamura had to show up at some point in all of this. As we see that Hanazaki's the first one to sort of speak up. He's just like, so I was reading over all the rules of this thing, and he's just like, and in today's battle sims, it looks like we could force a draw if we actually wanted to, right? Hasui, the operator's like, force a draw? What are you talking about? As Hanazaki's like, hey, well, if you go out and check the rules, it says that you earn points equal to the enemy unit's creation cost. And he's just like, and if the point gap at the end of the match is less than 200, the match, or 2,000, the match is a draw. And then there's a bit about each of us needing to contribute yuan and so on and so forth. As Soy just says, like, yep, it sure does say all of that, which is sort of like a nothing response, in my opinion, right? But I get there's the whole thing, because Hanazaki just starts talking more, so the author sort of wanted to break up the dialogue a little bit. But Hanazaki just says, like, hey, think about it. Say we just develop 5 super cheap units, whose total cost is way under 2,000, as we see that if each of these Squad 11 people were to create a unit that just cost 200 Triumph points, and he says all 5 of those would just cost 1,000 points. Of course, that's 5 times 200. And he says that way the opponent can never earn 2,000 points no matter what they do, because even if they kill all of our units, it is only 1,000 points, nothing more and nothing less. As Wakamura hears this, and he's just sort of like exclamates, like he's got a big, like he's very alert after hearing this. I mean, he's got the exclamation point in his thought bubble, as he sort of says, like, oh, we could sit back and earn no points ourselves, but since the other squad can't possibly reach 2,000, then according to the rules of the fight, it does end in a draw, right? And Sasumori's just like, but wouldn't that be And what's it say? Sasumori just says, like, hey, that won't be much of a match, though, right? And he says, don't we lose when all of our units get wiped out? And Hanazaki's like, nope, I mean, that's not what the rules say. It just says that we can force a draw if we do it, like I was saying, right? And Wakamura sort of starts to think for a second. He's just like, that's wild. By cheesing the strategy like that, we could probably get through with these special battle sims today without a single loss, technically speaking, right? As Hisoi just says, like, hey, I'm actually not so sure about all of this, right? As Hughes also says, like, hey, I agree with Hisoi there. Something's off about this, right? As she just says, like, hey, did you forget about the points that are earned for winning matches? And he says, a win today nets you 100 points, while a draw is only worth 20, while, of course, a loss is worth nothing. And she just says, like, hey, forcing a draw in all 10 matches would lead to 200 points, which is no better than 2 wins and 8 losses. And she's like, that's aiming kind of low, don't you think? And Hughes just says, like, hey, and also furthermore, a draw also gives our opponents the same 20 points. He's like, better than losing perhaps, but the gap will steadily grow against squads that actually win. Because of course the whole idea is, if both teams get a draw, that is at 20 points. So wherever you were before, you're in that exact same ranking. Well, if you win, you get 100 points while they only get 0. So you have a bigger chance of being able to best that team. As Hisoi just continues saying, like, hey, we've got more room for creative freedom today, so we gotta suck it up and find a way to crank out some wins, right? As Wakamura, who has sort of thought about this idea and was like, you know what, this could actually work, and we could not get our asses beat, he's sort of sitting here, like, all, like, gloomy and like, oh, man, I was hoping we'd have something. And Sasumori's like, oh, yeah, right, as he looks over to a really defeated Wakamura, right? But Hanazaki's like, alright, so plan won't work. And he's like, I thought I'd find an easy peasy way, no brainer strat to get everything all going on here, right? But he was saying, and just like, hey, your idea was still a really interesting one, Hanazaki. And he's just like, think about it. The squads that are up to date, or... And of course, as Hanazaki says this, it's like, oh man, what are we going to do, right? Hugh speaks up, and he's just like, hey, your idea is still a very intriguing one, Hanazaki. And he's just like, think about it. The squads that up through yesterday, we never managed to defeat once. It could be a legitimate strategy for forcing draws against those really poor mashups. As we get the whole idea here of Kakizaki Squad, Kitazoe Squad, and Suwa Squad were the only squads that they haven't managed to beat yet, right? Because their strategy just doesn't compare to theirs at all, right? Like, they're just incompatible in that way. As Hughes continues to say, like, hey, he's like, or we could also go and share this strategy, or no, he just says, like, hey, it could be a very legitimate strategy to forcing draws in those poor matchups, or we could share this strategy with other lower-ranking squads. And he says, then we could all employ the tactic against high-ranking squads rather than raising our relative position, right? So sort of bringing down all the squads at once is sort of what Hughes' idea is there. Sasumori just then says, like, hey, to collude with the others like that, to keep the strong squads from winning even more, and Hanazaki's just like, yeah, that could actually be really huge for us. But Wakamura just says no. And he's just like, I'm sorry, but we will not be colluding with other squads at all. And he just says, if the squads who've done well in the battle sims are suddenly targets of this ploy, then that would have to include Suwa Squad 7 going by yesterday's scores. And he says, Suwa, Mikumo, Oki, and Yoko, each of them is a squad mate of someone here on this team. And he says, we owe them for helping us with the assignments yesterday, and I refuse to pay that debt back with betrayal. As all the squad sort of looks over to Wakamura, and Hanazaki's just like, yeah, I mean, that's actually a really good point. And he's like if we would take aim at Mizukami Squad because they're in first base, I bet Kakizaki wouldn't agree to it because, of course, Toroi is on that team, and, of course, Oki has, who's his face? Oh, golly gee, if I could remember names ever, Kasho on the squad, right? So, like, even if we share this with other squads, they're not going to want to do it for that same reason of we've got people we care about there, right? And they're just like, oh yeah, Arufune's also on Mikumo Squad now, or Mizukami Squad, and like, yeah, it's hard to imagine anyone on Arufune Squad being hard-pressed, as they're just talking, as we cut over again to one of the monitor rooms, where we see nobody else but Tsukihiko Amo, the one S-rank agent in Border currently, as he's just sitting there and he's sort of just like, oh man, he's just like, Rokuro always with the cold feet. And this is big because this is the first time we've seen Amo in a while, and of course, we don't even know what Amo's S-rank trigger is yet. We just know that it's powerful, so there is still so much we have to learn about Amo, but Amo just says, like, hey, Rokuro is always with the code feed, and he's like, Kotori gave Wakamura Squad a helping hand because she didn't want to see them winding up in last place. And we see another squad guy with, who's his face here, Amo. I think this is another person from Katagiri Squad, but I don't know the particular name of this person, right? But, this person's like, oh, yeah, I guess so, right? And Amo just continues saying, like, hey, Kotori's assistance will have been a big waste if they don't use every advantage they've got now. Pretty much saying, like, hey, this is the wrong moment to give speeches about debts and betrayal. As the Katagiri Squad member is just like, oh, that strong of a sense of honor is one of Rokuro's best traits, though, isn't it? He's like, I bet Hasho and Hitazo is happier keeping everything above board, too. It's almost like, yeah, honor is all well and good, but how far does it go? Honor takes priority, but if we lose, will that just be all it is? And he's like, that sort of thinking just rubs me the wrong way. And he says, I can picture Rokuro thinking like that. As also, we suddenly cut over to where Arashiyama is, right? And I guess Arashiyama and his operator are having the exact same conversation. And Arashiyama's like, you know what? I'm actually seeing Wakamura from a really different angle now, right? And operator's like, oh, really? And he's like, because all I see is that bad habit of his where he runs from the hard decisions, right? But Arashiyama's just like, well, I'm not saying that he's totally gotten past all of that, but how do I put it? Something about this call that Wakamura is making right now just feels different to me, right? As we cut back over to the actual squad room of Wakamura themselves, as Wakamura's just like, all right, forcing draws will be our last resort, and he's just like, but I'm sure that we can come up with several ways to earn some actual wins. And he's like, well, any tots team, right? And we see that Hanazaki's like, yeah, well, just give me a second to think here, right? Sasamori's also just like, hey, since we can't predict our opponent's strategies, the best we can do is to develop a balanced army of units, right? And as he's thinking all this, Hisui sort of turns over to Hughes, right? And she's like, hey, Hughes, you got any slick strats, as she calls them, right? And Hughes just says, well, of course I do. Because it wouldn't be Husei from the neighborhood if this wasn't what he was doing, right? As Husei just says, like, hey, the simplest move here is to employ flying units for offense. And Sasamori is just like, why flying though, right? And Hughes just says, like, hey, given the previously stated abilities of flying Trion soldiers, they're able to absolutely decimate short-range soldiers on the ground. And in this case, real battles as well, as we get an idea of course, the bomber-type Trion soldiers that we have seen a few times in the series, and how much of a devastation they can actually bring, right? And Hanazaki's just like, well, you mean like how it works in real life? So what about that? He's like, that's a really tough strat to pull off, even in this game environment, right? And he's like, every squad's going to bring some ranged soldiers to try to fight all the flying units. I mean, it's just an obvious counter strat. He's like, our odds of winning like this are really just slim. And if we're hoping that they forget to account all of that, what's the point, right? And it's always just like, I mean, plus, if these flying guys are doing the fighting, then the limited budget means they'll only be really weak on defense, and flyers can't sneak around ground between buildings. They'll just be sitting ducks for snipers just to snipe instantly, right? And Hughes is just like, I mean, you guys have definitely described the matchups between different Trion soldiers well, but he's like, however, giving my Trion resources, my flying units can boast both firepower and durability. As we see that Husei's creation cost is at 2,520, right? He has a massive creating cost, and even when the squad budget is only that same 12,000, Husei still has so much more of an advantage with that super, super high Trion score, right? As we see that Hanazaki and Sasumaro are like, oh, that makes a lot of sense, so that's the angle you're trying to go on here, right? And Husei's just like, hey, taking down my flying units will require no less than a full squadron of snipers if my armor is just that good. And he just says, when the opponent's tactics are impossible to predict, most humans tend to prepare for the broadest of array of options, right? And he's like, I can't imagine that many squads would only bring snipers to the fight. And he's like, that much we can actually predict. And there's an interesting little bit of a note in there, because how Hyusei says, like, hey, when the opponent's tactics are impossible to predict, most humans, that's sort of like a red flag. They're saying, like, oh yeah, I'm not human, but I'm just saying most of them won't think this way. This is a little bit of a funny way of thinking in my mind, just the way it's all worded. I just find it pretty funny, right? But Hisoi just sort of starts slapping him on the back. He's like, hey, that's actually some really smart thinking you got there, Hughes. And she's just like, hey, you're actually the kind of fella who knows what he's doing, right? As all of a sudden, Wakamura is just like, hey, hold on a second. Wouldn't it be better to actually use that strategy tomorrow when all of these wins count for so much more? And he's pretty much just like, hey, because if we jump the gun today and do that route today, wouldn't the others try to come up with a counter strategy for us tomorrow, right? And Hyusei to this just says, like, hey, let's let them do it, right? And he's just saying, like, assuming other squads do come prepared with more snipers tomorrow, we can account that for our own counter strategy, right? And both Sasumori and Hanazaki again are just like, oh, so what you're saying is, like, you want to have us try to counter them so then we can go and counter them back, right? Or have them counter us so we can counter them back. And Hanazaki's like, oh, and that's why today we'll use the flying units, which are just really begging to be super countered, right? And Wakamura is just sitting here and listening to all of this, and he's like, oh, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. He's like, when we can't predict the opponent, we guide them into making a move we can predict, right? And he then looks to his entire squad and says, like, hey, this is really great. And he's like, we're going to be going with Hyusei's idea today, right? And Wakamura's like, all right, team, keep that strategy in mind as you design your units. And everybody pretty much just gives a, okay, sounds good, we'll do it. Yeah, all right. See, I've watched some Oscar Lost in Space recently. That's a very good show. It's sci-fi like World Trigger, right? But of course, at this point, we suddenly cut over to the last scene of the chapter, as we see that Miwa is sitting there with Yoneya. Hey, these are actually two A-rankers that we know the names of, right? As Yoneya is sitting there, and he's just like, oh man, I'd expect nothing less from a neighbor. Or he's like, as he sort of says, he's like, oh, I mean from a Tamakoma guy, right? And he's like, his combat experience is definitely showing through. As Miwa just says, like, I mean, yeah, he is very well acquainted with short-term battles, so, I mean, of course Hyusei would know what he's doing, right? And he says, while all of the other squads are struggling with the new rules and mechanics, he says, Utagawa, Kitazoe, Mizukami, and Wakamura squads are planning to exploit their opponent's psychology. Of course, we know what Utagawa squad is doing, because of course we had that whole thing with Yuma in last chapter. Kitazoe, we don't know what Kitazoe squad angle is on this. Of course, we have seen Mizukami squad, and of course, we also did see Wakamura squad. So it is going to be actually interesting to see what Kitazoe is coming up for. But an interesting image that we do get is we see all of these characters on screen, the prominent ones from each squad, as we see Mizukami, Yuma, and Hyusei, of course, from the three Utagawa, Mizukami, and Wakamura squads. But then in that Kitazoe squad, we also see Kikuchihara and Hana on the screen, and of course those two are the people who are presumably putting together this counter strategy in Kitazoe squad, so I won't be surprised at all if that is a good portion of next chapter, is seeing what Kitazoe squad tactic is, right? But as Miwa sort of says that, Yoneya's just like, alright, so do you think that one of those four will be the ones to win really big? But Miwa says, no, I don't think so. The victor today is likely to be Suwa's Squad 7, as we see they change their screen on the monitor, and they look at a good old Osamu working on his Triumph Soldier creations. And that is where we end off chapter 239 and 37 pages of World Trigger this month. This is a very interesting chapter. I feel like I say that for all World Trigger chapters, but you can't lie to yourself, it is true. The ending note of this chapter is, of course, saying that yes, Osamu will come up with a good strategy to best all the other squads, because Osamu is Osamu, and that is that, right? Makes a lot of sense. And I mean, yeah, you sort of have to have your winners win, and of course, Suicide Squad 7 is at the forefront right now, so a lot of characters are going to try to counter them, but Osamu will probably come up with something very important and big to sort of give this whole idea of, yeah, don't worry about it, we're just going to win out eventually, right? One thing I do like about this chapter is how we do stay on that whole thing of going through every squad and getting their viewpoints and seeing what the different ones are. Of course, we start out the chapter on a really high note with Okoma's and OG Squad, and Okoma's comedy just really slaps well. I mean, it is just funny as can be, and while I think Oki's sort of whole idea of like, hey, the whole idea is to, or Oki and Tsuji's idea, to make Trident Soldiers that the people of Mikado City will enjoy, he has a good point there, but I feel like that point is really talked about a lot more in, what's this other squad? If I could actually think what the thing is called, in Kakizaki Squad 3, where Taichi is, because of course, Taichi is like the big gamer sort of dude here, so of course we know that those are the kind of creations that he is going to make. So I feel like it was expunged on a lot better there. The whole Kuruma Squad 5 thing was really just a basis to explain the whole flying mechanic, and that was really it, and to show that Yuba's really struggling. I don't really feel like they've got a solid plan down, but yeah, they're really just not an important squad in general. It feels like a bunch of people who don't really matter sort of got lumped in there. And of course, then going to Mizukami Squad, who, it's Mizukami Squad, we know what to expect from them at this point. I mean, they're only like, I think they're on volume 25, so like, they're the third squad? Or no, there's just a second squad to get the cover, right? So they're obviously extremely prominent. And then, of course, going to Wakamura Squad, showing what they've made of, right? It's very interesting that we actually do get 7 different point of views throughout this whole chapter, going between, like, all of the different monitor rooms and everything else. Or I actually think it's 9 now I'm thinking about it, because we got the 5 squads. We got OG Squad, we got Kakizaki, we got Kuruma, we got Mizukami, and we got Wakamura. That's 5 squads. We got Katagiri and whoever he's talking to. We got Amo and whoever he's talking to. And we got Miwa and Yoneya. So, yeah, that's 8 point of views. So there's a lot of switching through in this chapter. Or no, then we also get Arashiyama for a brief moment. So there are 9 point of views, which is a lot. Like, 9 point of views, like, oh boy. Like, Ashihara just does it differently. Then, of course, ending off on a note of, okay, Osamu knows what he's doing. And, yeah. I don't have too much else to say about this chapter in that case. I do feel like next chapter we will probably finish out the round of squads that we haven't seen, which is Kitazoe, which of course we know that Kitazoe is planning something. We have not seen Kodera Squad, which should be interesting because of course Kitora is on that squad. I don't think we've seen, no, we've done some Ninamiya point of view because of course Chika has so much Tryon, or have we? I don't think we've seen Ninamiya yet. And then of course we have Murakami, which we also haven't seen his squad yet. So we've got about 3 squads, about 4 squads left to actually cut to before we've gone through all of them. So I'm sure next chapter will be mostly focusing on what those other 4 squads are thinking before we actually cut through to Battle Sims beginning, which hopefully won't be too long. Of course, at this point, we do not have a date when the next chapter of World Trigger is coming out during. So, I mean, that sort of just sucks in a way, but of course, there's no definite ever with World Trigger, right? We could have a next chapter come out in a month, we could have the next chapter come out in 2, so that's sort of just a sad truth with World Trigger. Yeah, I really don't, oh no, we actually do, March 3rd of 2024, so it looks like we actually are getting a chapter in March. Of course, it could be delayed, but we actually do have a date. Forget everything I just said, I'm not cutting that out of the video, because I've got to cut out so much from this episode already, because I can't talk. But with that, I don't have too much else to say about this chapter of World Trigger. Thank you guys so very much for watching. I enjoy always talking about World Trigger, and of course, I enjoy talking about manga and anime in general. That's what I do on the channel. I've got a bunch of series talking about, like, Oshinoko. I still got to finish off my Hell's Paradise Chigoku Rocksu episode reviews. And I also have the Shonen Jump podcast, where I talk about all of the Shonen Jump various things. You can find all of that on the YouTube channel and the podcast on wherever podcasts are found on the internet. It is up on most places, if I'm not mistaken. So go check them out there. And yeah, thank you guys very much for watching. If you did enjoy this, hope you won't mind liking the video, leaving a comment down below, and subscribing to the channel. All it does is just really helps me out a whole lot. And yeah, I don't have too much else to say, and I hope to see you guys next time for World Trigger chapter number 240. Man, we're going to be sort of a milestone chapter next time. 240. That just seems like a sci-fi number to me, if you know what I'm saying, right? But I don't have too much else there. It sounds like an even number to me. That's what it really sounds like. A number divisible by 2 a bunch of times, 120, 60, 30, and then 15. And 15 you can't really divide it by 2 anymore, but like if I think that's something with like prime factorization, I don't really know, but I'll see you guys next time for World Trigger chapter number 240. Again, this was chapter 239, titled, I don't know if I even actually said the title at the beginning of the video, but it is the Away Mission Test Part 35, and I'll see you guys next time. This is Glowplasma 231 signing out.